He sold my grandmother's ring without telling me. My brother-in-law just smiled from across the kitchen island, stirring his coffee like he hadn't said anything at all. We needed liquidity, he said. Colette agreed it was the right call. I looked at my sister. She was examining her cuticles. That ring had been left to me, specifically, by name. In a handwritten note my grandmother tucked inside an envelope with my name on the front. My sister shrugged. "It's just a ring, Avery. Don't be so sentimental about objects. It wasn't just a ring. It was a 1940s Art Deco diamond set in platinum that my grandmother wore every day of her adult life except the day she gave birth to my mother because her hands swelled. She had told me that story 4 times. I knew every detail of it. And now it was gone, sold to cover the deposit on a vacation property in Kelowna that my sister and her husband were flipping for profit. A profit I would never see. That was 6 weeks before they changed the locks. My name is Avery. I'm 32 years old. I work in forensic accounting, which means I spend my days finding the money people try to hide. It is deeply ironic given what happened to me. Given how long I didn't look. When our parents retired and moved to Nova Scotia 2 years ago, my sister Colette and her husband took over the family home in Oakville, a 4-bedroom Victorian on a tree-lined street worth somewhere north of $1.4 million. The arrangement, as explained to me over a Sunday dinner where I was not allowed to finish a single sentence, was that they would maintain the property, pay the carrying costs, and hold it in trust for both of us, until our parents were ready to sell or transfer ownership formally. I would receive a fair share when the time came. That was the word used, fair. In exchange, I was given use of the detached garage apartment at the back of the property. It was small, a converted space above a 2-car garage, but it had a separate entrance, a decent bathroom, and a view of the backyard maple that turned a color in October that made me forget everything wrong with my life for about 3 minutes per year. I paid reduced rent. I told myself it was a reasonable arrangement while I rebuilt my savings after my divorce. My brother-in-law had other ideas about what was reasonable. The first sign was small. He started parking both their cars in the garage below my apartment, which meant the sounds of an engine warming up at 6 a.m. became my alarm clock whether I wanted it or not. Then he had a contractor come in to replace the garage door, without telling me, and for 2 weeks I had no way to lock my entrance from outside. When I pointed this out, he told me I was being difficult. When I escalated to my sister, she said he was doing me a favor by upgrading the property, then the ring. Then, on a Wednesday evening in February, when the temperature had dropped to -18 and the city was under a wind chill advisory, I came home from work to find a moving company's plastic wrap around my furniture and a new key code on the door that didn't work with any combination I tried. My key, the physical key I had carried on my ring for 2 years, no longer fit the lock. They had changed it while I was at the office. I called my sister. She let it go to voicemail. I called again. Same. My brother-in-law picked up on the 3rd call. He sounded bored. "We need the space," he said. "We're converting it for rental income. You've been here long enough." I told him he couldn't do this without notice. He said technically the verbal agreement was month to month, and he decided not to renew it. He said I could come get my things over the weekend. He said he hoped I understood this was a business decision and not personal. I stood in the driveway in February in Ontario, my work bag over my shoulder, my car keys in my hand, watching my own furniture through a window I couldn't open. The wind off the escarpment was the kind that gets inside your collar and doesn't leave. I could have cried. I probably should have. Instead, I sat in my car and turned on the seat heater and stared at the garage door and started doing what I always do when I don't know what else to do. I started accounting for what I actually had. Current asset, car, registered in my name. Current liability, no housing. Cash on hand, modest but real. Outstanding injustice, significant. Legal standing, unclear but worth examining. Collateral damage. My grandmother's ring, which I had not finished grieving. Items in the apartment, my furniture, my files. 3 boxes of books, and my grandmother's storage unit key, which I kept on a separate ring because I had never figured out what to do with the storage unit. That key. It had been sitting on my keychain for 14 months, since the executor of my grandmother's estate, a family friend named Mr. Okafor, had handed me a plain white envelope at the will reading with my name on it in my grandmother's handwriting. Inside was a note and a small brass key. The note said, "Avery, you were always the one who paid attention. I hope you'll know what to do with what I've left you. Don't let them rush you." Gran. I had assumed it was furniture. Old dishes. Maybe the boxes of fabric she kept meaning to turn into something. I had been to the unit once, early on, seen tarps covering shapes in the dark, and told myself I'd go back when I had more time and more emotional bandwidth to sort through it. That was over a year ago. My sister had asked me twice what was in the unit. I had said I didn't know yet. She had made a noise that meant she thought I was being avoidant. She was right, but not in the way she meant. I drove to the storage facility at 9:30 at night in the middle of a wind chill advisory, with nowhere else to be. The facility was a squat concrete building off the QEW in Burlington, the kind of place that has a keypad at the gate and fluorescent lights that flicker in a way that suggests they've been meaning to replace the ballasts for a decade. The security guard buzzed me through without looking up from his phone. Unit 114, ground floor, end of the row. The padlock was stiff. The key fought me for a moment, the way old locks do when they haven't been turned in a while. Then it gave, and I pulled up the roll door, and the smell hit me first. Not mildew, not dust, something dry and careful, like cedar and mineral oil, like something that had been maintained. I turned on my phone flashlight and swept it across the interior. The unit was about 200 square feet. The back half was covered in green moving tarps, the kind professional movers use, weighted down at the corners. But it was what I noticed first along the side wall that stopped me. A small climate control unit. Portable, but professional grade, the kind that keeps humidity stable year-round. It was plugged into a heavy-duty extension cord that ran to an outlet I hadn't noticed in the darkness. My grandmother had been paying to climate control this unit, on a fixed income, for what looked like years. I pulled back the nearest tarp. It was a painting, large format, maybe 4 feet by 3 feet, in a heavy gilt frame. I didn't know enough about art to identify it immediately, but I knew what an artist's signature looked like, and I crouched down and angled my flashlight at the lower right corner, and the name I saw there made me stand up very slowly and take a step backward. I pulled back the next tarp. Another painting. Smaller, but the brushwork had the same quality, the same controlled chaos in the foliage, the same way the light was handled, same signature. There were 11 paintings in total, each one tarped, each one in a frame, each one in a condition that suggested someone had been extraordinarily careful for a very long time. Along the far wall, behind the last tarp, was a flat wooden storage rack, the kind used for archival print storage, and inside it were wrapped canvases, unstretched works, 14 of them, each wrapped in acid-free tissue and sealed with archival tape. My grandmother had been a seamstress her whole life. She had never mentioned painting. She had never mentioned knowing anyone who painted. She had certainly never mentioned any of this. I sat down on the concrete floor and stared at the room my grandmother had left me while my sister changed the locks on an apartment I had quietly paid rent on for 18 months, and my ring sold itself into the Okanagan vacation property market. I did not call anyone. I locked the unit behind me, drove to a Marriott on the highway because it was the closest hotel with availability, and checked in using points I had been saving for a trip to Portugal that I kept not taking. I ordered room service pasta that arrived lukewarm. I ate it at the desk and opened my laptop and started doing what I do. The name on those paintings. I had seen it before, in passing, the kind of name that drifts through general cultural literacy without necessarily landing. A mid-century Canadian painter, active primarily in the 1950s and 1960s, associated with a loose group of figurative artists working out of Montreal and later the Laurentians. Not a household name. Not yet. But the art market had been moving in his direction for the past decade, and 2 years ago, a retrospective at a major Toronto gallery had recalibrated what the market thought of his work. I found the retrospective catalogue online. I found auction records. I found a sale from 18 months ago, one canvas, 46 by 30 inches, that closed at a regional auction house in Montreal for $280,000. There were 11 framed works in that unit and 14 unstretched canvases. I closed my laptop and looked at the ceiling for a long time. My grandmother had grown up in Westmount. Her family had moved to Ontario after the war. She had never talked much about her childhood, except to say that her mother had been particular about beautiful things, and that her father had known interesting people. Interesting people in the Montreal of the 1950s could easily have meant artists, could easily have meant the kind of friendships that resulted in gifts of work, in trades, in quiet accumulations over decades that a woman of modest means in her later years might not know what to do with, except to tarp them carefully and keep them cold and write a note to the granddaughter who paid attention. I called Mr. O'Carver at 8 the next morning. He was a retired Crown attorney who had handled my grandmother's estate with the methodical care of someone who had spent decades making sure nothing was missed. When I told him what I had found, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother mentioned the unit to me. She said the contents were clearly and specifically yours under the estate." He paused. "She was concerned," he said carefully, "that the wrong people might develop an interest in them before you had a chance to properly assess them." I asked him if he had known what was in the unit. He said he had known it was valuable. He had thought it prudent not to advertise that fact. Then he gave me the name of a colleague in Toronto who specialized in art authentication and estate matters. He said, "Don't rush. And don't tell your sister yet." I didn't tell my sister. I told the authentication specialist. Her name was Dr. Ferreira, and she met me at the storage unit on a Saturday morning with 2 colleagues and a camera system that I was fairly sure cost more than my car. She spent 4 hours. She did not say much while she worked. When she was finished, she sat in her van with a thermos of coffee and her laptop and her 30 years of expertise, and she pulled up comparable auction results and insurance valuations, and she gave me a number that I made her repeat twice. Conservative private sale estimate, 1.9 million. If we approach the right auction house, with proper provenance documentation, with the retrospective narrative attached, the lost private collection, the seamstress's studio, the granddaughter who found them, Dr. Ferreira thought we were looking at closer to 3 million, possibly more. The market for this artist was active. Buyers were hungry. A discovery story this good didn't come along often. I sat with that number for 3 days. I went to work. I reviewed spreadsheets. I ate lunch at my desk and answered emails and said nothing to anyone. I had been temporarily staying with a friend from my accounting firm, sleeping on a pull-out sofa and pretending everything was fine. And at night, I lay in the dark and thought about a woman who had packed 11 paintings in green roofing tarps and paid $140 a month for a climate-controlled storage unit and never said a word. On the 4th day, my sister texted to ask when I was coming to collect the rest of my furniture because they needed the space cleared by the end of the month. I did not respond to the text. Instead, I called Mr. Oakville and asked him a question I had been turning over for 72 hours. Was there any claim my sister could make to the contents of the storage unit? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "None whatsoever. Your grandmother was specific to the point of legal redundancy. The key, the note, the letter of instruction she filed with me separately, all of it points in one direction." He paused again. She was a thorough woman. I think she may have anticipated complications. My grandmother had anticipated complications. Of course she had. She had watched those complications develop over decades. She had sat at Sunday dinners and watched one granddaughter be talked over and managed and quietly diminished, and she had made a plan. She had written a note. She had paid $140 a month and said not a word to anyone except the retired Crown attorney she trusted to hold the line. I went back to the storage unit one more time before the auction house took possession of the works for cataloguing. I sat on the concrete floor in my good coat because I hadn't brought anything to sit on, and I looked at the paintings still under their tarps, and I thought about my grandmother at a dinner table in Westmount, talking to an interesting person, accepting a canvas that she somehow knew was worth keeping. I thought about her carrying that forward for 60 years through a marriage and 2 children and a move to Ontario and widowhood and a fixed pension, and the slow work of watching a family drift into configurations she hadn't planned. I thought about the note. You were always the one who paid attention. The auction was held in Toronto, handled by one of the 2 major houses with a significant Canadian art division. Dr. Ferreira had helped prepare the provenance documentation. The discovery story, carefully worded, was included in the catalogue notes. The collection was described as a significant private holding, assembled by a Montreal family in the mid-20th century, consigned by the sole heir. My sister found out the morning the catalogue went live online. She called at 7:45. I let it go to voicemail. She called 4 more times. On the 6th call I picked up. She had questions, rapid, escalating questions about ownership and fairness and what Gran had really intended, and whether I understood that the family home had carrying costs, and whether I had considered that she had given me subsidized housing for 18 months, and whether I appreciated how much her husband had done for the property. The questions came so fast, they didn't leave room for answers, which I understood was the point. When she finished, I said, "The collection is legally mine, Colette, entirely and specifically. You can speak to Mr. Okafor if you'd like to confirm. I hope you're well." Then I hung up. The auction took place on a Thursday evening in late April. I sat in the 3rd row in a blazer I had bought specifically for the occasion, a dark navy wool thing that had cost more than I usually spent on myself, and I watched 11 paintings and 14 works on paper sell over the course of 2 hours and 40 minutes. The room had the specific quiet of concentrated money. No gasping, no dramatics, just the low voice of the auctioneer and the paddles and the numbers climbing. Final total, $2,840,000 before the house's commission. I did not cry in the room. I cried in the car, sitting in the parking structure on King Street with my blazer folded on the passenger seat and the city making its sounds outside the concrete. I cried because of the money, and because of what the money meant, and because my grandmother had been paying $140 a month on a fixed pension to make sure I had an option she never told me about, and I wished I could tell her that it worked. My sister's husband sent a formal letter through a lawyer 3 weeks later, claiming an equitable interest in the collection on the basis of the familial relationship and the housing arrangement. Mr. Okafor forwarded it to me with a single line of commentary. "This will not succeed." It did not. The estate documentation was watertight. My grandmother had been, as Mr. Okafor said, a thorough woman. I bought a condo in Hamilton with a view of the bay. I established a small investment account. I paid off the remaining balance on my car. I made a donation to an arts foundation that supported emerging Canadian painters because it seemed like the right way to use a small piece of what she had left me. And I located a silversmith in Toronto who specialized in Art Deco reproduction and restoration, and I had my grandmother's ring remade from a photograph and a description I gave from memory, set in platinum with a round, brilliant diamond, because I paid enough attention to remember every detail of a ring I was told not to be sentimental about. My sister has not spoken to me since the lawyer's letter was dismissed. My brother-in-law sent a text once in the fall, which I read and did not answer. I hear things through my parents, who remain carefully neutral in the way parents do when a situation has exceeded their capacity to manage it. The Oakville house sold 6 months ago. After the mortgage and the carrying costs, their share was less than they had anticipated. My father mentioned this to me gently in passing, over the phone one evening. I said I was sorry to hear that. He said he thought they'd be okay. I said I thought so too. I think about my grandmother most on the days when someone at work tries to manage me, tries to talk over a conclusion I've already reached. tries to tell me that something I found doesn't mean what I know it means. On those days, I think about a woman who packed 11 paintings in green, moving tarps, and paid her bills quietly and waited for the right granddaughter to use her key. I think about the note. I think about the word she used. Attention. She was right. It was the only thing I ever had to give, and it turned out to be enough. I think about that storage unit a lot. Not the paintings, not the number Dr. Ferreira said that I made her repeat twice. I think about the climate control unit plugged into the wall, the fact that my grandmother, on a fixed pension, had been paying every single month to keep that room at the right temperature. She never told anyone. She never asked for recognition. She just quietly did what needed to be done, for years, because she had decided that I deserved an option. That is the kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't post about it. It doesn't need the room to know. My grandmother had it in her bones, a sense of what was right and what was owed and what a person does when they love someone without condition. She didn't protect that collection because it was valuable. She protected it because she had made a decision about who I was, and she wasn't going to let the noise of the family around her change that. I spent a long time being the kind of person who noticed everything and said nothing. I noticed when the agreement changed. I noticed when the word "we" started meaning something it wasn't supposed to mean. I noticed the way my sister's husband made decisions and delivered them as facts, and I absorbed them the way I had been taught to, quietly with my chin up, telling myself that patience was the same thing as strength. It isn't. Patience without discernment is just a slow way of disappearing. What saved me in the end wasn't luck. It wasn't even the paintings. It was the habit of paying attention that my grandmother had recognized in me before I had fully recognized it in myself. My job had trained me to look at numbers until they told the truth. My grandmother had counted on me to do the same with everything else. When I finally stopped absorbing and started accounting, when I sat in that car in February in -18 and actually listed what I had versus what I was owed, that was the moment things shifted, not because the situation changed, because I stopped pretending I couldn't read it clearly. There's something that happens when you decide to use what you actually know instead of waiting for someone to give you permission. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel like a turning point in the moment. It felt like driving to Burlington at 9:30 at night in the cold, because I had a key and nothing else to do, and I'd run out of reasons not to look. The courage wasn't in the auction room. It was in turning that stiff lock and pulling up the door. My grandmother left me money, yes, but what she really left me was the evidence that paying attention over a long period of time and acting on what you know with patience and care produces something real, that quiet, steady accumulation of right choices, made not for applause but because they were right. That is what held for 60 years under a green tarp in Burlington while the rest of the world went about its business. I still have the note she left me. I keep it in the drawer of my desk in the condo. Some mornings I read it before I start work. It still says the same thing it said the first time, but I understand it a little more each year. You were always the one who paid attention. She was right, and so was she.